All right, thanks so much to everybody who's joining us, whether you're here in Zoom or tuning in online via YouTube. It's a pleasure to have you all today. My name is Allison McManus. I am the Managing Director at the Freedom Initiative. The Freedom Initiative is a nonprofit organization dedicated to seeking freedom for political prisoners in the Middle East and North Africa, though we focus mostly on Egypt and Saudi Arabia due to the high number of political prisoners in those countries. We are very interested in ending systems of wrongful detention across the region. Today, we're going to be presenting our newest report, In the Shadow of Authoritarianism, which investigates the ways in which Egypt and Saudi Arabia extend their repression here in the United States. We began to pay close attention to this phenomenon when many of our colleagues, families of detainees, or others who had escaped detention in the region were still not able to truly enjoy freedom here in the US or elsewhere, even though they were in supposedly safe countries. You'll be hearing more about this shortly. If you believe in this mission, if you enjoy the event, or if you just want to find out more about our work, we'd love to have your support. Please do check out our social media. You can sign up for our weekly briefs that include news and analysis, or consider a tax-free donation, and we'll share more information about how you can do that in the chat. That said, without further ado, I am thrilled to turn the event over to Thanassis Cambanis. Thanassis is a writer, journalist, and adjunct professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He's the director of Century International, which is the Century Foundation's Center for International Research and Policy. Thanks again, and over to you, Thanassis.
Thanks, Allison. It's a great honor to have the chance to moderate this discussion today. I'm looking forward. Well, looking forward might be, it might connote more enthusiasm rather than curiosity. I'm eager to learn more from today's participants who have done some really phenomenal work in unearthing the details in a phenomenon that I think most of us are generally aware of and alarmed by, but which research, like the report that we're going to be learning about more today, lifts up the rock and shows some really distressing and disturbing innovations in a long historic way in which authoritarian regimes reach across their borders to shut people up, kill them, intimidate them, silence dissent, and otherwise try to limit repression, extend the repressive arm abroad and limit dissent at home. So that's what we're going to be learning about today. I'm going to just quickly introduce our panelists, tell you the running order of today's event, and then turn it over to our participants. So we're going to be talking to Yana Gorokhovskaia, who's the research director at Freedom House. She most recently oversaw the research for Defending Democracy in Exile, the organization's second major report on transnational repression. And we'll be talking to the two co-authors of the Freedom Initiative's latest report. That's the report Allison mentioned, In the Shadows of Authoritarianism, Egyptian and Saudi Transnational Repression in the US. So that's Amr Afifi, who's the Freedom Initiative's research manager. According to the bio he gave me, he wants to be described as Freedom Initiative's research manager and also a PhD candidate at Syracuse University. I would also like to identify him as one of the co-authors of this fantastic book, Broken Bonds, The Existential Crisis of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, which I had the distinct pleasure of editing, which is available at your local bookstore. And our last panelist is Abdullah Alaoudh. He's the Freedom Initiative's Saudi director, and he's also the co-founder of and Secretary General of the National Assembly Party, which is Saudi Arabia's first openly declared political party. And he was also formerly, before this job, the director of Gulf Matters at Democracy for the Arab World Now, Dawn MENA, which is a fantastic advocacy organization that was founded by the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi shortly before his murder. So today we're going to be talking about the findings of this new report by Amr and Abdullah. We're going to hear about the experiences of dissidents and exiles from Saudi Arabia and Egypt and their experiences of repression and violent targeting in the US. We're going to learn how to better understand how these efforts at repression are part of a broader program by both governments. I think we're going to hear about some policy recommendations, and we're going to hear about how to contextualize this sort of MENA-specific manifestation of transnational repression in the broader scheme of cross-border hunting and persecution of dissidents. The session's going to wrap up on the dot at 2:20. We're going to go to audience questions at 2 o'clock. Throughout the session, please, I invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A button. If you're watching this event on YouTube, I think there is a YouTube chat function, and Freedom Initiative staff are monitoring those questions, and they will put them into our Zoom chat, and we will answer all your fantastic questions. So we're going to start with you, Amr. I've read the report, but I don't assume that everyone who's watching this has. So I want you to start by telling us what is the sort of top line finding, and what is new and significant about the types of repression that you documented that are being conducted by the governments of Saudi Arabia and Egypt.
Thank you so much, Thanassis. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start with a quick anecdote just that happened just a few days ago on the eve of April 21st, when over a billion Muslims around the world were about to celebrate Eid. 72-year-old Egyptian-American activist was scrolling through her Facebook just to find her name listed as a terrorist by Egyptian officials. They designated her as a terrorist for activism she has done historically and continues to do against the regime on U.S. soil, right? So, and I think this case, and the person's activist's name is Samia Harris, right? This comes in that list as well, was Ali Mahdi, who's a U.S. asylum seeker, who was also designated as this list and who's been tried and sentenced in absentia for his activism in the United States. And it comes only a few months after Sharif Osman, another Egyptian, was detained in the UAE for over 40 days for calling for protests in Egypt while on U.S. soil. Sharif is also a U.S. citizen. He's Egyptian American, right? So what we try to do in this report, and when you ask about the top line, these are the stories that come to mind. What the report hopes to show is that repressive regimes that the U.S. calls allies, similar to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, do not think of their borders and do not think of their repression as like stopping at their geographic, within their geographies. Their borders end where their borders extend to the bodies and to the voices of the last dissident they can reach, whether that dissident is in DC, whether that dissident is in Istanbul, whether that dissident is in Doha, wherever they are, they aim to repress them and they aim to quell their voices. What we also hope to show, or what we also show in the report, is that the subject of these violations are not necessarily people who have ethnic ties to these countries, right? That people are exposed to transnational repression, and people who have been transnationally repressed include journalists and include family members of people who are not necessarily originally Egyptian, not necessarily originally Saudi. And what we hope that this report pushes for is more codification of what transnational repression is, more awareness about what transnational repression is, and a whole of government effort to end this type of repression on U.S. soil. What we highlight as well, and I'll stop talking in just a second, is that transnational repression that Egyptians and Saudis are conducting put them in a group of countries that are closer to China and Russia, not a group of countries that the U.S. should think of as allies, and that these threats and these violations that are no longer threats and that are ongoing are a threat to U.S. democracy, are a threat to how civil society here functions, are a threat to the type of knowledge that's produced, and are a threat to the well-being of U.S. citizens and their family members and their friends, and that these threats need to stop.
So what, I mean, okay, I assume everyone who's following this issue knows about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which is the sort of most grotesque version of a repressive government reaching beyond its borders. In this case, they, lure a citizen who's abroad into the consulate, murder him, lie about the murder. But it seems, looking at this report, that you all have codified like a really wide range of types of from murder down to minimal harassment. Can you give us an overview of the scope of tools that are used, and maybe from least harmful might be the wrong word, but from sort of the most minimal tools to the maximal, so we can get a sense of what is the menu of problem that we're confronting here.
I'll jump in really quickly, and then Abdullah and Yana, please go ahead. A lot of what we documented, so similar to what you said, Jamal Khashoggi is worst case scenario, right? But it's not the only thing that happens. The most minimal thing we see is defamation, for instance, right? Where Egyptian TV hosts would put the picture of U.S. officials or former officials, senators, members of U.S. civil society. We're talking about people like former Congressman Tom Malinowski, for instance, or Michelle Dunn or Maggie Saadani, or all these people. They put their pictures up on state-owned television, state-run television, and they point at them and they say, "These are terrorists, right? These are people," and they sometimes deny them into the country, similar to what happened to Michelle and David Kirkpatrick, the now New Yorker journalists, right? So that's as easy as it gets, and then it only gets worse from there, right? We have instances of transnational repression that happen in the home country, in which families are taken hostage for what members abroad say. This happened to Ali Mahdi's father, for instance, who was detained, and we actually sent him a voice note from prison saying, "Officers here are telling me, if you stop talking, I will be released." Ali stopped talking. He was not released, so Ali continued his activism, right? This is also the case with Hussein Khalaf, who is a legal permanent resident who was detained because he was the son-in-law of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, a now deceased Muslim or Islamic scholar and cleric. And then it goes from there to the abuse of international intelligence and sharing mechanisms like Interpol interviews, or there's a body that we have been hearing about increasingly and has become increasingly active called the Arab Interior Ministers Council, AIMC. Arab Interior Ministers Council is a sort of an intelligence sharing body that has has a lot of the interior ministers around from the Arab world, where they share information about supposedly criminals, but now increasingly political dissidents, and have successfully, unfortunately, been able to extradite a number of Saudi dissidents from Morocco back to Saudi Arabia, and were the main party behind Sharif Osman's arrest in the UAE, a U.S. citizen who, had their efforts succeeded, would have been a U.S. citizen extradited for enacting their constitutional rights back into Egypt. And it gets progressively worse from there, all the way to what we see and what we document, and what has been increasing in the U.S., which is physical and verbal threats and death threats levied against activists here, both Egyptian and Saudi. People say call dissidents and identify themselves as security officers and say things like, "We know where you live. Unless you stop, we are going to hurt you." Or they do the accidental bump in. And if you've lived in an authoritarian regime or done work there, I'm sure you have, Thanassis, right? These bump ins are never really coincidental, right? And someone runs into you and says something like, "It's a shame that you're hanging out with all of these people. It would suck," who are not necessarily as politically active as you are. "It would suck if anything happened to them back home," right? "It would suck if anything happened to their families back home." So it's a level. It's at its core, what we show in the report. Transnational repression is an attempt to export a security infrastructure outside of Egypt and outside of Saudi Arabia into DC. So you're as afraid to say something in DC or New York as you would in Cairo and Rio, as you would be in Cairo or Rio.
Abdullah, do you want to add some, because the report discusses surveillance a lot too, and I know this is something that has gotten a lot of public attention and has certainly affected many of my friends and colleagues. These Pegasus infections of people's phones and whatnot. So, can you add a little bit of insight into what kinds of digital surveillance and other similar types of tools are being used to track, harass, and intimidate people?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, actually, just to add to the point of the kinds of repression and tools that these government uses, varies from, of course, the killing, the murder, the assassination attempts, and since Mohammed bin Salman came to power, while previous Saudi government have also used one way or another of transnational repression tools, Mohammed bin Salman just brought it to another level. So you see, not just Khashoggi, like just after Khashoggi, they attempted to assassinate Saad al-Jabri in Canada, Iyad al-Baghdadi in Norway. So we're talking about like Europe, Canada. It's like the whole world is just a theater for their butch operations. And then it goes on with the, of course, the threats. And I remember, for example, when Jamal Khashoggi was talking about his, like the threats that he faced online on a daily basis, and we used to not take it seriously until they have done what they have done. And then we knew that this is a pattern, a systematic approach to silence critics and to murder them, to also push them toward desperation, to psychologically manipulate them through the bots on Twitter, through the threats, the intimidation, using the family back home. And to your question, yes, hacking and surveillance. And hacking and surveillance, of course, can be physical when people like watch you. There's like cases where, for example, there are actually two activists in Europe, one in Geneva, who was physically followed by someone. There is a case where, for example, in the US, a Saudi dissident, two arguably or two allegedly Saudi agents followed a Saudi dissident in Los Angeles, and they tried to kidnap him and bring him back to Saudi if it were not for the FBI, who intervened and protected the dissident and aborted the operation. So we're talking about like a large scale approach that does not stop at borders. And with the surveillance, you get this whole program in Saudi Arabia where they actually hacked cell phones, got into DMs, hack social media accounts. There are cases actually, like my friend Yahya Asiri, his cell phone was hacked at least 3 times. These are the times that we knew about these hacking attempts and hacking operations. Umar Abdulaziz, his cell phone was actually hacked a few weeks before the murder of Khashoggi, and some experts think that this somehow was linked to the murder, of knowing what Khashoggi was going to do, what Khashoggi was doing, where Khashoggi was going during that time, and what kind of projects that the two were working on. There is also the report that was published later by The Guardian, some other outlets, in which they say there are tens of Saudi dissidents, Egyptian dissidents, UAE dissidents who were hacked either directly or through their relatives, laptops, you name them. by this like hacking program operated by NSO, namely the Pegasus program. And by the way, all of these hacking revelations only these are the like only Pegasus program. So we're not talking about like the larger scale of like outside this program. So it's a larger scale of and a pattern of hacking, intimidation, and threats to citizens.
And there was a Saudi employee of Twitter who leaked information to the Saudi as well. And I guess I think digital surveillance gets a lot of attention just because it seems sexy somehow. But the reason why it matters is because these governments are willing to use the information gained from the surveillance to violently silence people, right? So surveillance in of itself is a detail, and it doesn't really matter unless someone's taking that surveillance and then using it to blackmail
exactly
people, threaten them, pursue them, try to kidnap them, try to kill them. And that's what, in my view, makes this period of activity exceptional and interesting, is that, I mean, all these governments, and in a minute we're gonna move on to the broader context, but it seems to me like these phenomena have been going on for as long as I'm aware of, right? As long as recorded history, frankly, governments have tried to do this sort of thing. What makes this exceptional is that the actions they're willing to take. So, Yana, I wanted to ask you, how does this fit in to the global picture? We're talking about two regimes here. We're not even talking about the UAE and some of the other problem regimes just in this one region, but you have taken a global scope in your work, and I really encourage our viewers to look at this Freedom House report, which is not only excellent, but it's short, which is like a rarity in NGO reports. It's like 10 pages. So kudos to you for doing hard work and then actually condensing it. So tell us, what's the global picture, and are these regimes, Egypt and Saudi, like among the worst in the world, or does it, when you take the global view, is there a rogues gallery of a lot of regimes that are equally violent in their repression?
Yeah, thanks for that. So first of all, I want to say how much I enjoyed this report issued by the Freedom Initiative. I think one of the things that is unique about this report is that Freedom Initiative took quite a broad, kind of a wide lens to look at this issue. So they did go beyond co-nationals, and also looking at the effects of transnational repression. So not just the tactics that are being used, and not just the violence that results from these tactics, but the silencing effect, the damage to intellectual knowledge, academic knowledge, economic damage. I think that this is really important to demonstrate that this has really wide impacts on societies, including democratic societies, right, where these people now reside. I think, so the work at Freedom House that we've done has taken kind of a broader view of transnational repression. As you just noted, this is not a new phenomenon. Transnational repression has happened for a long time, as long as there have been exiles. Authoritarian regimes have tried to reach them. There's always the case of Leon Trotsky. There was a case of a dissident that died via car bomb in DC in the 1970s. So this has been going on for a long time. Of course, the difference now is that many more people are able to leave repressive regimes, and technology kind of has bound us together. And so we're able to elevate the voices of exiles, but also, unfortunately, that makes them more of a target for authoritarian regimes. To set the two countries into context, you're absolutely right. So there is kind of a group of countries that we've identified as perpetrating transnational repression. There's now 38. I should say that Freedom House tracks physical direct incidents of transnational repression. So we were just talking about the kind of array of tactics. We focus on assassinations, assaults, renditions, unlawful deportations, Interpol notices, the physical acts. And that's just really for data reasons. These are easier to track, easier to verify. And then, of course, there's the whole universe of indirect or online or proxy repression. But in terms of the physical direct acts, there's 38 governments. Of those, 10 are responsible for about 80% of all the direct physical transnational repression we've seen. Among the worst of the worst, so Egypt is the fifth highest, or the perpetrator state with the fifth highest number of incidents that we've recorded. I would say that, so what kind of distinguishes Egypt and Saudi Arabia from some of these other countries is the level of violence that is perpetrated, so the level of successful violent attacks. One thing that characterizes the Saudi regime also is the personalization of the targeting, and this, I think, really stems from the fact that the state and the royal family are really one and the same. And so when you offer criticism of one, you're really offering criticism of both. And so the targeting that happens tends to be very, very personalized. And I also want to underline what the other panelists have said about kind of how the tactics tie together. I think one thing that kind of gets lost is that people don't experience just one tactic. It's not that it's just your family that's being harassed, or you just get online messages, or someone bumps into you in the street. It's the fact that this is the entirety of your experience. So you get all of these things all at once, and they often escalate, and one feeds into another, so that, as people have already pointed out, information collection feeds into targeting. Targeting feeds into family repression. So this is a collective impact on a person's life. And so I think that's another thing to really keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's, Freedom Initiative isn't doing this, but it's very important to me always to go out of our way to not exceptionalize the region. You hear about these terrible dictatorships in the MENA region, which I've spent most of my career documenting as well. And it's just important to note, these are not somehow uniquely Arab or Middle Eastern pathologies or techniques. These, maybe Tajikistan, Russia, other places, and not so long ago, it was Latin American states or African states doing this. So these are not uniquely Arab or Middle Eastern problems. However, right at this particular historical moment, we have I think, crisis level of misbehavior by these regimes. And I think it's also important to spotlight what your report at the Freedom Initiative did, which is point out these are American allies doing this in the US. So it's one thing if Russia or Iran is pursuing dissidents on American soil, because what would one expect? These aren't partners or allies. It's another thing when, in Egypt's case, the U.S. is bankrolling this regime, or in Saudi Arabia's case, the U.S. is trying to sort of have it both ways, criticizing the human rights behavior, but being so tightly intertwined. So I did want to ask two questions, really, to all of you, and I'll ask the first one to you, Yana, and then take it in the round. You started talking about this, which is, how does this affect U.S. democracy, right? So it's obvious how this is bad for, the political ecology of the home country. How is it bad for the U.S. or U.S. democracy when exiles or members of the diaspora are targeted this way on our soil?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different reasons. One is we just have to understand that repression doesn't stop at states' borders, and so as much as I think people who live in democracies like to think that we are these sort of islands of freedom, that's not really the case. The authoritarian regimes have quite an extensive reach into democratic countries, both physically and digitally. So that's one thing to consider. I think it limits, in a really practical way, this sort of repression, when it does actually silence people, it limits the kinds of information that we have access to. It actually degrades the information environment. It makes our policies less precise because we don't have good information about what's happening in other countries. We don't fully understand the entirety of the picture. Some of the most reliable sort of sources of information are people who live in exile, or people who are members of diaspora, right? Because they have reach into their own countries, they're knowledgeable, they speak the language, all of that kind of the perks that access has. And so when those people are silenced and when they're afraid to share that information, that degrades the level of sort of the kinds of policies we're able to craft. And also just, I mean, just generally speaking, people don't, the standard is people should have the same access or the access to the same set of rights, whether or not, whoever they are, if they live in this country, they have, freedom of expression and other rights. And the reality is their enjoyment of those rights is really different because they experience transnational repression. And I think that's something that has been harder to understand for people who don't experience transnational repression. So I think the kind of on those two issues, I think just getting back onto this issue of, partner states or allies perpetrating transnational repression, I think that's a really serious issue as well. And it's one that we have to take on seriously because it does limit the foreign policy responses that we can craft to transnational repression. You're absolutely right. The world's biggest perpetrator of transnational repression is China, but China is an adversarial state. And so the kinds of policy responses that have been crafted to China are different than the ones that have been crafted for the Saudis or Egyptians or, Rwanda is another country that has a lot of security links and ties to the United States and also perpetrates transnational repression. And we have to see our foreign policies kind of comprehensively, that they also prioritize human rights in this very serious way and not just kind of security priorities.
Abdullah and Amr, do you have anything to add about how this not only harms the countries of origin, but the sort of host country where this repression takes place?
Abdullah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think the idea here is that, so first of all, when the US needs Saudi Arabia for oil, when they go over there and fist bump the very man who ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the dictator in Riyadh, they just interpret this as a green light. They interpret this as as actually turning a blind eye, and that's sometimes more or less what happens in most cases. So we see, for example, one of the most recent examples that, before I answer your question, is Colonel Rabih al-Nizi, who is in the UK, and we're talking about like last month case. It's not like it's not an old case even. So he was a former policeman in Saudi Arabia who fled the country, defected from police, and just last month he announced that he's no longer in Saudi Arabia, no longer is part of the force, and just criticized Saudi Arabia because he's not happy with the human rights record. A few days after he announced that, they started harassing him online, and then they took it to another level. One verified account named Fahad Musattam actually took it upon him and them to locate Rabih al-Nizi in the UK, and they started a reward, actually a $10,000 US reward for whoever locate Rabih al-Nizi in the UK. And they started doing this. They started posting picture of where he had a live chat, where he had a live video, where he was taking pictures. They started analyzing the background and where he is. And so I think this kind of behavior is not just affecting Saudi Arabia, it's affecting the UK, affecting Europe, affecting the US. And you're talking about someone who resides in these countries and not feeling safe because he's threatened or she is threatened. So we're talking about like the safety and security. We're talking about the sovereignty of these states and how their own, protected residents and citizens are not safe because of these quote unquote allies that we support, we pay money to, we pay visits, and we protect. I mean, the US completely protects Saudi Arabia, supports militarily and financially Egypt. And it's shame to see how they turn a blind eye to these countries' behavior.
Thanks. I want to remind our audience members that I invite you to submit questions. You can do them on the Zoom or on the YouTube platform. We would love to engage and answer any of your questions. Ahmed, before I turn to you on this question, so a couple of things leapt to my mind as I read your report. So you guys, Doctor, you haven't mentioned this in our conversation today, but you talk about what I would view as like abusive lawsuits in the courts, harassment lawsuits. I think what I see as one of the direct costs of this is, there's a direct subversion of rule of law in the U.S. by these practices, right? So this is the same whether it was a foreign government doing this or the mafia domestically. We'd say this threatens our rule of law. If courts can be abused, and secondly, we become complicit. I mean, this is a big problem that I see is that especially these rich, friendly regimes, UAE, which you don't talk about in this report, and Saudi Arabia, these are engines of some wealth creation or rents that various constituents in the United States benefit from. And so I see a growing confluence of like powerful constituencies and figures who see, they like American civil liberties, but they also really like the money they make off of their relationships with these repressive governments. And so we see a growing number of businesses, lobbyists, politicians, think tanks, other entities that won't sign on to, let's say, the findings of the reports that Freedom House and the Freedom Initiative have published, because although they probably privately agree that, oh, this is awful, they're like uninterested in antagonizing these fantastic sponsors of a lot of whether it's corporate partnerships or grants or whatnot. So I see this as a big growing problem. Complicity. And the final thing I want to raise is the leverage question, which I think applies a lot in the Egypt case, where we have this sort of weak dependent state that's a donor recipient, and yet we have learned that we don't have any leverage over their behavior, because this is simplistically, but I think somewhat accurately framed as like the too big to fail problem, right? It's like, Egypt is awful, and the Egyptian regime can say, well, do you want us to collapse, or do you want us to hand it over to the Islamists? And somehow this always works. So the United States, through very different presidencies, has ended up having the same frustration, where they find themselves unable, and this goes all the way back to like the late 90s and conflicts over the Egypt air crash investigation. You realize, like, oh my goodness, the United States can't make these people do anything. And I find it funny when folks think that like the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Russians will be able to make the Egyptians do what they want. And I'm like, no one can make them do what they want. This leverage problem, is gonna persist no matter who's bankrolling it. Those are the things I see as the sort of blowback manifestations of this kind of transnational repression coming home to roost. But with that, Ahmed, what if any extra costs do you see to U.S. democracy or rule of law of this sort of uptick of misbehavior on U.S. territory?
Well, thank you for that, Thanassis. And I think Yana and Abdullah covered it well. Transnational repression makes us less informed in the U.S. It makes us less safe, and that these killing effects are something that, as a Saudi or Egyptian dissident, or as someone with professional, personal ties to these countries, are something you are going to have to live with, and something that affects the way democracy works here. And I want to pick up on what you were saying with sort of the complicity or question of leverage. And a lot of what we find in doing advocacy at the Freedom Initiative is that, and Abdullah touched on this, authoritarian regimes have learned to game the system in the United States, right? And they've learned how the political scene works here. And you find that there is sort of like authoritarian to authoritarian cooperation or authoritarian learning in political sciencey terms, right? Where they're not only using the same tools to repress people, they're not only using the same frames and types of legislation. Like a great paper by Meideroui showed how like terrorism law was formulated in Egypt and was sort of like exported to Saudi just to persecute certain groups or individuals. But also in terms of just like the direct connections to lobbyists, the same lobbyists that lobby for Saudi are the ones that lobby for the UAE and are the ones that lobby for the Egyptians. And one of the things that we try to bring out in the report, and we say quite explicitly, is that transnational repression in this way and by these regimes in a way that's systematic and is a manifestation of authoritarianism going global. And authoritarianism going global doesn't always have to have the scary face of beheading or like cutting journalists into pieces, but can also be a benevolent face of someone like knocking on the doors of congressional representative and saying, you know what, like this human rights thing, let's think of political prisoners, let's think of all this stuff as human rights, let's put all this human rights stuff into one folder, close that folder, and let's open the folder of like geostrategic cooperation or the folder of whatever. However, so they've learned to game the system in the United States and they've learned to speak this type of DC rhetoric, right? But what I think we are yet to catch on to, and what we need to understand as well, is that, and what studying transnational repression tells us, is that these regimes think of political prisoners not as a human rights issue necessarily, right? The way they internalize and discuss the signals that the US says by only using conditioning 10% on the release of political prisoners in Egypt as part of the aid package, right? Or the fist bump to MBS, they take these as green lights. So they think of political prisoners as a very political issue, as cards they can use, as hostages they can take to get what they want out of all the other out of the US. And we see the US falling into this trap, right? And you start asking questions about what the lines between ignorance and malice, right? So you see the executive branch intervening in the court of Kamal's ex-fiance and MBS, right? Or Sultan versus Biblawi. You see the executive branch like directly taking steps to intervene on behalf of these authoritarian regimes, on behalf of these abusive individuals against US citizens or against US legal permanent residents. And it starts from, the courts all the way to like different sanctioning schemes that the US government has for people who commit human rights atrocities, like Magnitsky Law, for instance, where often when NGOs come together, activists and human rights researchers who are as brilliant as Abdullah and Yana and others in the space come together and file submissions. A lot of times these submissions are waived for national security interests. I'll end with this. What we see, or what we waive away as national security interests, is actually lessening and decreasing our leverage as the United States into these countries. These countries are taking use of that, and it's coming back to bite us, or to nip us in the butt, so to say, and affect our democracy and US citizens negatively.
So I was going to ask a bunch of other questions, but I want to actually make sure we cover the policy responses and then turn at 2 o'clock to our audience questions and keep them coming in. I see a couple of questions have already been posted. Thank you very much. So I'm collecting all those and I'll put those to our panelists starting at 2. So let's talk about what can be done. You were starting to mention some of this. I want to go first to Yana. I'm going to cycle by Yana, then Abdullah, then Amr. So what are the tools in our arsenal? And although this report focuses on the US government, I'm happy to hear if you have executable action items for other, whether it's international bodies, like things that really can be done to whether it's things that can be done to stop the abuse of the Interpol system, to, any other ideas that you have percolating. So Yana, what are your top viable proposals? Because happy to talk pie in the sky, but I know you have like usable recommendations that you've generated. So
yeah, the stakes keep going up, not only solutions, but viable solutions. So on the domestic side, or what host countries can do, I think, to give credit to countries like the United States and others, whether that's Canada or the UK or France, Canada or governments have taken some security responses, right? So the FBI has a website, you can report transnational repression. We know, even independent of that lots of security agencies and law enforcement will provide individualized protection, or at least warnings to people who may be targeted. We know the FBI does that. We know that the Metropolitan Police does that. We know the Canadians do that. So that's great. It's sort of the lowest hanging fruit, I would say, and it's a policy response to transnational repression that relies on mechanisms that already exist, which is a security infrastructure that most democracies already have. I would say that where there has been much less action, or sort of kind of a stop and go, is in the foreign policy responses. Amr mentioned a couple of them, whether that's the Khashoggi ban or the Magnitsky Act. A lot of the transnational repression, sort of the day-to-day, won't rise to the level of Magnitsky sanctions, so that makes that difficult. Khashoggi ban doesn't name people who are under the ban, so that makes it difficult. So there is a limitation to the willingness of governments to use foreign policy or sanction tools they already have at their disposal when it comes to this. And part of this is the discussion we just had about competing foreign policy interests that countries may have, especially with governments they view as allies. I would say one that we haven't talked about, but is one that we've thought about a lot in Freedom House, is immigration and asylum, and the fact that democracies have securitized their borders to a degree that actually puts people in jeopardy of experiencing transnational repression. And it does so in two ways. The first is it keeps people out of democracies. So it's incredibly hard for people to come to the US or to Canada or to Europe and to claim asylum, to actually make the claim for asylum. And if we keep people out of these countries, they will end up in third countries where they are much more likely to experience transnational repression. In Freedom House's data set, most transnational repression takes place where both the origin and the host country are not democracies. And this is explained not only by the fact that these countries share an illiberal ethic towards opponents and activists, but also because honestly, people are stuck in third countries. They're stuck in places like Turkey, they're stuck in places like Russia that cooperate with other authoritarian regimes, and democracies are playing a role in making sure those people are stuck in those places. But then the other side of it is when we do allow people to actually come to democracies, they often end up in this overburdened immigration and asylum system where it takes a really long time to prove your asylum claim and to receive some sort of permanent status. And not having access to permanent legal status in a country has its own silencing effect. So people are much less likely to report any kind of targeting. First of all, they're much less likely to speak out about human rights violations or engage in any kind of activism to make themselves a target, essentially. And second of all, even if they do those things, they're much less likely to engage with law enforcement or immigration because they feel like that might actually impact their status in the country. So I think lots to be done on immigration. That has been sort of the slowest uptake for democracies for basically reasons of politics and polarization. At the international level, I'll say that there's been an Interpol reform. It has not effectively stemmed the tide of Interpol abuse, but there's attention at the host level. Countries are paying attention to Interpol notices and screening them. But regardless of that, we still see people handed over to authoritarian states. Last year, Serbia handed over a Bahraini activist on the tarmac in spite of an ECHR injunction against his return. So that continues. There's some hopeful signs at the UN, but that's also kind of an area where much more action is needed.
Thanks, Yana. Abdullah, what are your top action recommendations for reversing the tide on these abuses?
Yeah, of course. So I think one of the things that the report recommended is legislation. so advanced legislations in Europe or in the US. The US, we are seeing proposals, Chris Murphy and others, and we have seen, but we also need to have a similar effort in Europe. So that's one important aspect.
So this would be legislation that defines and criminalizes so I hate this label you all use, by the way, transnational repression. I think it's like way too anodyne and weak a way of describing something that is, one, not new, and two, is illegal violence across border. I mean, it's like, it's like if you talk about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi or the attempt to kidnap an Iranian dissident from my neighborhood in Brooklyn as transnational repression. Transnational repression, I think of like people on being nasty on Twitter to like their political critics. I don't think of the kinds of atrocities that you're documenting. So I do think there's like a semantical problem between the boringness of that term and the severity of this like crisis with terrible human impact and political consequences that you're documenting. So just parking that aside, it's something I wanted to say. What would, that's like an aside to my question. The question is, what would you be able to do differently once you had a law that codifies and defines this as a crime above and beyond the sort of existing legislation that criminalizes attempted kidnapping and harassment and so how would that what would that enable us to do more effectively?
So first of all, so broaden the definition to include practices usually exercised by countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, not just Russia and Iran. To include the hacking, effects, to include threats online, to include how the actual surveillance, because I know the physical surveillance, because I know there are I'm not really an expert at this, but I know there are criminalized acts in, for example, stalking someone, but if you put it in the political context, this one will make the law enforcement aware of this specific act, because when you call the police, when you talk to the authorities, they are aware of this political context. This is a specific crime, not just someone who hacks your cell phone because they want to scam you or take your money. This is like a government-supported effort to harm you, harm your family, affect you. So it's a specific act that needs to have a specific legislation, and this is what we call for. So this is like one, I think viable proposal, and the other is to have a coordinated effort between the law enforcement on one hand, the legislative body on the other, and activists and civil society on the third, to make everybody aware of these practices, to create ways to prevent them from happening again, and also to protect the civil society community generally in the West.
Amr, do you have any to add? Maybe the FARA reform idea from your report, or any of the others that you think are worth spotlighting here?
I think that like one of the things we do talk about in the report is how sorry, comments from Cardis. I was going to answer just something else about community impact. I'll talk about that in a second. But there needs to be fair reform. A lot of lawyers are able to represent clients, many of whom can be abusive. People have committed human rights abuses on quote unquote like civil matters without that could come off as not furthering any political interest, but indeed they are without reporting it to without reporting them, without like registering
FARA is
under
the
FARA.
Foreign Agents Registration
Yes.
Act, which requires so if you're a lobbyist and you're lobbying for a foreign government, it's transparency. You have to register, and it's publicly available that you're working for X foreign government. But for whatever reason, lawyers that do this don't have to register, which is weird. And sounds like now maybe that wouldn't help the behavior, but at least it would enable watchdog groups to more quickly identify lawyers who are working on behalf of these governments.
The last thing I wanted to say in terms of actionable things is that in a couple of instances, like there's a trust issue when it comes to reporting transnational repression, right? Especially in New York, the NYPD has not had the greatest record of dealing with members of the communities who are most affected by this, namely Muslim communities in the US, right? The FBI has the same problem where a lot of their policies and tactics have been quite abusive and harmful, and there's just a lot of mistrust.
Pause 1 second, Ahmed. Pause on that thought. So we're going to move to audience questions now for the last bit of our session. And one of our audience questions is on this very subject that you're talking about. So I want to ask the question before you start answering it. And the question is, how can we build trust among communities most impacted by transnational repression, many of whom may not feel comfortable reporting incidents to law enforcement? So go back to your answering of this question.
No, it is an important question, and it's something that we we struggle with and we have to deal with, right? Like it is the case that the FBI is the body that is investigating and is trying to address, to criminalize transnational repression or go after its perpetrators. And it's also the case that a lot of the people who are affected by this just simply and justifiably so do not think of the FBI as the first entity they're going to reach out to report these incidents, right? And one of the policy recommendations that I think is important to highlight is that a lot of this happens to communities, right? And what these regimes try to do is sort of isolate these dissidents outside of their communities, further away from their communities, so their impact decreases. And the way to respond to that is to have community awareness programs, to train police departments, train FBI officials on addressing some of the horrible, quite racist things that they have historically done, and make sure that they are providing actionable plans in terms of and transparent ways of reporting back to the communities that they're supposed to work on behalf of, who are most affected by transnational repression. The last thing I want to say about this is that the dissidents are everywhere in the United States, right? So places where we can expect the police and FBI to be quite savvy in, like DC and New York, but there are areas where people face these repressive measures and call their local police authorities, and their police authorities are and this happened in one of the interviews I conducted, are we're in the middle of nowhere, New Hampshire, right? How we don't know what to do when you get a death threat. We don't know what to do when you're sent an email or you're called by a security official and so they give you your address and they say, we're going to come and kill you in a few days, right? Most people and so there needs to be a lot more training amongst law enforcement, especially on campuses, especially in distant cities and towns where there is a diaspora, that these types of abuses are levied against Egyptians and Saudis there.
And I'm curious, I don't know if any of you can answer this question, but it leapt to my mind immediately when I was reading these reports. So there's this question of racism and also of political expediency. So is the experience different for dissidents who are white Russian Christians who are anti-Putin dissidents on US soil, or Chinese dissidents against the Chinese communist regime on US soil? Do those dissidents have a fundamentally different or better experience with getting official protection or some kind of or does the problem persist even when it's not a Muslim dissident from a country whose regime happens to be like a great friend of the U.S. government on their, misbegotten counterterrorism program.
If I can just maybe I can speak to that a little bit, but also just to build on the previous discussion of legislation. So I think there's kind of two issues. One is without an official definition, without a government definition of transnational repression, this very simple thing of just tracking the fact that transnational repression, however you want to define it, whether it's all physical, whether it's more expansive than that, governments don't track things they don't define. So that's just one of the key issues here. We need a definition. The issue of criminalization is trickier. A lot of the physical acts of transnational repression are crimes in and of themselves. The UK has amended their national security bill to actually treat transnational repression kind of like a hate crime. So there's kind of a more serious punishment for a crime that has a transnational repression element. But one of the things we have to watch out for, and this goes to your question about kind of communities and their experience, is the fact that transnational repression is sometimes perpetrated by members of the diaspora. So other members of the same diaspora who are pressured into collecting information, informing, threatening, spying, using their professional career, their professional access to provide information. What we don't want to do, given the kind of history and legacy of law enforcement and lots of, here in the United States and lots of other countries, is we don't want to provide more mechanisms to try and solve this problem by providing more mechanisms to help criminalize diasporas that are already may experience racism and other forms of oppression. So I think that's something to watch out for, in that we don't want to treat everything like a nail because all we have is a hammer. So I think that's one thing. I don't necessarily think that some diasporas have an easier time with it than others, partly because, as Amr mentioned, just generally law enforcement lacks knowledge about this. So when you call and report a crime, it doesn't really, transnational repression, it doesn't really matter what your ethnicity is. Law enforcement generally just doesn't understand what you're talking about. Like, why would a foreign government threaten you, and how could they actually reach you in this country? People don't really understand that. But I think we should consider, when we're thinking about policy responses, that a lot of these communities are vulnerable already by virtue of identity, and we don't want to exacerbate that vulnerability by trying to protect them from foreign states.
So one of our audience members asks, and I think this is a great question that's relevant to what you were just talking about, which is how does it make sense to define the wrongful detention of Americans abroad as transnational repression? So maybe Ahmed or Abdullah, since that's one of the claims in your report, one of you can explain how you're defining that as transnational repression.
Okay, I'll chime in. So, for example, one of the cases that comes to mind is the case of Abdurrahman al-Sadhan, who, by the way, was also one of the people, we think, one of the 6,000 accounts that was revealed by the two spies implanted in Twitter during that infiltration incident back in the day. And so Abdurrahman al-Sadhan basically is a Saudi dissident who was operating an anonymous account on Twitter in which he criticized the Saudi government. Suddenly they knew him, they discovered who he is because of that hack and infiltration. They arrested him, and then they also threatened his sister. They want her to be silent about her brother. His sister is an American citizen residing here in the States. So I think in this case, you realize how that wrongful detention back home in Saudi Arabia, one, actually was a result of an operation that took place here in the States in Twitter. And the three agents, Al-Zabara, Al-Jibrin, Abu Ammu, all were here in the States when this happened. And then it also later affected Abdurrahman's sister, who is residing here in the States. So you see how this is all linked to and comes back to the state.
Okay, and I'm not sure you answered my question, but that's okay, because we're going to skedaddle forward. I mean, the question was, how is arresting Americans abroad a manifestation of transnational repression? Because that's always been a U.S. policy concern when Americans are arrested abroad, although let's be clear, in truth, America cares a lot less when those people are actually like considered foreigners who happen to have been naturalized, right? So like Americans abroad, like, to be gross, that's not my view, but I think it's the government's like, are they like real Americans or are they like hyphenated Americans from country X? Because if they're hyphenated Americans from country X, some governments still treat those as equal. Not all of them do. So I just think that like that's a piece of the problem. But Ahmed, one of the other questions from the audience, and if you want, you can answer the question that Abdullah sort of half answered. The question was, how do Saudi and Egyptian transnational repression affect religious minorities abroad, including non-theists? I think we mean, like non-religious people or atheists or like folks who are resolutely like not religious. Please, if you 1 or 2 minutes can
yes. I'll try to be really quick. So on the first question, what we talk about in terms of transnational repression in the report is that transnational repression is a mode of governance, right? Like repression is not just an act that happens and therefore it's or at least transnational repression. It's think of it as like repression plus, right? So when we think of detaining why detaining U.S. citizens is a form of transnational repression in the cases we talk about in the report, it's like the detention is explicitly because they do not want these U.S. citizens to take advantage of their constitutional rights as U.S. citizens, right? So that includes, for instance, similar to how Abdullah talked about it, but it also includes the case of Salah Sultan, for instance, who was detained because of his own profile, but his detention has successively gotten worse, and direct attacks and torture was levied against him because of his connection to the U.S. and because of who his family is and what they do, right? So and I think this way of thinking of transnational repression is important because it opens up to how the regime thinks about this repression, not only how we think about it, right? Like we have to take into account why they're doing what they're doing and how they're doing it, and that's why we include it as part of transnational repression. In terms of how it affects members of religious minorities or non-theists, is that goes back to something we talked about in the report and I touched on earlier, is that a lot of what transnational repression is exporting the security environment and the repressive environment in the domestic country to the host country, right? From home country to host country. So, and we see in the case of Sharif Mansour's family, for instance, who are theists because they're Quranis, they're still it's a sect within Islam, similar to Shias in Saudi, for instance, but they are persecuted once for being Quranis, and they're also persecuted for the work that Sharif does in CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists, right? So it's and a lot of the persecution that happens to them is because of Ahmad Mansour, Sharif's father, who is a well-known, well-recognized religious leader amongst Quranis as well. So in that sense, in that sense, the violations that they endure are an extension of the targeting. The violations that they endure as transnational repression are an extension of the targeting and patterns of repression that exists in the home country as well.
Okay, so another question for the for Abdullah and Amr, which is personal and a good question. What transnational repression have you experienced personally? Can you tell us a little bit about what happened and how you dealt with it and how it has shaped your life in the U.S., how it's shaped your work? So the question is to both of you. If you can give us a 1 or 2 minute capsule of your personal trajectory with this problem.
Yeah, I think I'll start. So basically, I was here in the States when my father was arrested in September 2017. And while I was vocal even before that, I became more vocal about his arrest, about the pattern of repression in Saudi Arabia. They first suspended my passport, Saudi passport. The Saudi embassy here in the States actually told me that the only way for me to renew my passport is to go back to Riyadh to fix the issue. And then they also told me at another point that all my services are frozen, which is like a phrase in Saudi Arabia used that to indicate that you cannot complete any paperwork that is recognizable in Saudi Arabia unless you do the unfreezing process. And they told me for this to happen, you need to go back to Saudi Arabia. At another point, at the third point, actually, they offered a one-way ticket to Riyadh, and they said just to
everyone's dream.
Yeah.
One-way ticket to Riyadh.
And they told me just to discuss some issues and you can go back to the US, but they didn't work on it so much because it's just one-way ticket. They didn't even make an effort to make it a two-way ticket for me to believe this. There was like, and then there were incidents like I was given in Chicago a book report on a book on Saudi Arabia. And one of the attendees actually came to me and he said, I was sent by the Saudi Arabian Cultural Mission, which is part of the embassy that oversees social activities in the US, to spy on me, to write a report on whatever I say. And he said, I'm even also worried about the other person. So I asked him, what do you mean the other person? He said, there's also another guy was sent for the same reasons, just a backup to make sure that whatever I report back to them is accurate, and just to make sure that so we're talking here about things that happen in the States. And then like in 2000, and this is like a bit older, in 2015 and 14, I was on a scholarship, and then from Saudi Arabia, and then they suspended the scholarship. And then they said it's because of social affairs. I filed a lawsuit, and then in court, and I won the lawsuit, but in court they actually admitted that the reasons for suspended my scholarship is my quote unquote political activities. And then which is like, I mean, what is more interesting in the thing is that they in court they admitted that there was a report written by Saudi students who were tasked by the Saudi embassy here in the States to report on my political activities, and the report was actually signed off by the Saudi cultural attaché, and then signed off by the ambassador, Saudi ambassador, and then was sent. A copy of that was sent to the Saudi, the Ministry of Education to suspend my scholarship. A copy was sent to the royal court, and then a copy sent was also to the Ministry of Interior. All of these ministries were involved in that report, just to show you how all of these ministries were actually involved in the report. Was written by students, tasked by
That's a lot of effort to harass one young analyst.
Yeah, it's just this is just an example of what they do here in the States.
Ahmed, can you give us a 45-second tour of your personal experiences with transnational repression?
It'll be even shorter. I am quite privileged and quite boring in the sense that like no one has expressed any care about me just yet.
They haven't read this book yet.
Not yet. No. Encourage you all to buy the book. But yeah, that's me.
So Yana, if you can answer this in 1 minute, it's an audience question. It's a good question. Are there any best practices that governments have enacted elsewhere that have been effective that we could emulate?
Yeah, issue visas and humanitarian visas for diasporas that are at risk of transnational repression. Also, be specific visas for human rights defenders. Canada has a specific visa program for human rights defenders. NGOs nominate the people, they get vetted that way, and then they go to Canada and enjoy a certain amount of safety there. Other governments could adopt similar practices.
Well, this has been a great discussion. I'm going to wrap it up now so that we can finish as promised before the hour and 20-minute mark. I'm Thanassis Cambanis. I'm the director of Sentry International, and we've been talking today with Yana Gorokhovskaia, who's the research director of Freedom House, and with the co-authors of this fantastic new Freedom Initiative report, Amr Afifi and Abdullah Alaoudh. The report is called In the Shadows of Authoritarianism, Egyptian and Saudi Transnational Repression in the US. I encourage you to read it. I also encourage you to read this report that Freedom House put out, which I don't mean to overplug the other product, but I just want to show this. I was looking at this during the report. This is like this really handy infographic of the top culprits. Anyway, it's harrowing reading, and I think we didn't talk about this enough, but it works, right? I mean, repression does silence people. There is a chilling effect. It's not just, bad in a vague sense for our rule of law. It is a set of tactics that harms people's lives. It makes people's lives unpleasant or worse. It kills people, it estranges people from their families, and it silences political dissent. And as a citizen of a democracy, as citizens of democracies, we have to say it cheapens our own democracies if this is what happens in our countries. And I do, I'm almost 50. I remember that back in the days during the Cold War, the US really welcomed dissidents from certain countries. It made it easy for them to come to the United States and get citizenship and then do whatever they were going to do, whether it was be political citizens, dissidents, or just get on with their lives. It's a shame on our democracy in the United States today that we do not make that easy. And it's something that's one of the easiest fixes to be had, an executive decision to actively welcome and embrace dissidents. So thanks to all the audience members who came. Thank you to Ahmed and Abdullah and Freedom Initiative for producing this fantastic work, and Yana for the work she does, and to all three of you and your colleagues for identifying meaningful, actionable ways to combat this problem. Thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, Thanassis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.